Welcome to Family Meal at Rethink, where we sit and we chat with leaders in the food space who have done really incredible things to help inspire not just our team, but also folks that follow us on social, just to share some of the great work. Especially, we feel it's more important now more than ever to help inspire this generation and the next one to continue to make positive change.
Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. This is really amazing what you're doing.
Marion Nestle is a renowned nutritionist, author, and public health advocate. Her groundbreaking work has illuminated the complex connection between food, politics, and health, profoundly impacting our understanding of the food industry and its influence on our lives.
See, I would never have been able to say that.
For decades, she has challenged conventional wisdom and advocated for transparency and accountability in food policy. Her books, Food Politics and The Unsavory Truth, have become essential reading for anyone seeking to understand the system that shapes our diets. Her unwavering commitment to educating the public and empowering individuals to make informed food choices has made her a pivotal figure in the movement toward a healthier and more equitable food system. We are deeply honored to have her with us today. You with us today, and discuss critical issues facing our food landscape.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The honor is mine.
I'd love to hear your journey, to be honest.
The journey, yes. Okay. First of all, I wrote a memoir. It's called Slow Cooked, An Unexpected Life in Food Politics. It came out in 2022. I was 19 when I was married. I don't recommend that as a life choice, but it was what women did in those days. And then, I had kids and I was home with kids and I was really bored. I went back to school. I went to graduate school when I had 2 kids. So I'm trained in basic science, which doesn't sound like it has a lot to do with food, nutrition, and public health, except that nobody messes with me about the science. It's turned out to be very useful. And my first teaching job was at Brandeis University, which is a small college outside of Boston. And I was teaching in the biology department. I was teaching cell and molecular biology to students who really struggled with it because it's extremely abstract. And the department had a couple of really strange rules that I've never encountered anywhere else. One rule was that you could only teach the same class 3 times in a row because they didn't want instructors to get stale. And then you had to switch to whatever the department needed, whether you knew anything about it or not. Okay. The philosophy being that if you had a doctorate, you knew how to learn, and you could do this faster than freshmen and sophomore students. So my 3 semesters of teaching cell and molecular biology were coming to a close. And students, this was in 1975, and students were sitting in the department chair's office begging for human biology classes. They wanted something that they could relate to. So they said, you're up. You want human physiology or you want human nutrition? That was the choice I was given. And I knew enough about physiology to know that I would never be able to explain kidney acid-base balance to anyone ever. I would never understand it. It's still true. And so I picked nutrition. And I picked nutrition for positive reasons as well as negative ones, because I love to eat, I love food, and there was a lot going on at the time. It was 1975. Francis Moore Lappé had just published Diet for a Small Planet. The Center for Science in the Public Interest in Washington, D.C. had just been founded, and they had produced a book called Food for People, Not for Profit, that was just full of little teeny articles about every conceivable food issue you could think of. It could have been published yesterday. It was so ahead of its time. And then Linus Pauling had published Vitamin C in the Common Cold. And I wanted to know whether there was anything to it. I was curious. So that was the basis of the class. And then there was 2 very, very long articles in the New York Review of Books by a professor at Brandeis who was a sociologist who had written articles about the politics of food and oil as if they were the same thing, same kind of politics. And I used those in the class. And then I asked the class to pick some idea that was floating around about diet and health. If I were going to pick a contemporary one, I would say vitamin A. Does vitamin A cure measles? Which is what RFK Jr. is arguing. And then the students would, in those days, students knew how to do research and could go to a library and read all the articles and write papers that were written in English and parsed reasonably well and organized reasonably well. And so they wrote papers on it. And that was the basis of my knowledge of nutrition. Because there were 50 students in the class, there were 50 papers on probably 30 different topics, and all of the papers said exactly the same thing. They said the research on this topic, whatever the topic was, there's not very much of it. What there is not very well controlled. These were biology students, so they would know things like that, right? And at the end of reading those papers and grading them, I knew a lot about nutrition. I really knew a lot. And I loved it. I just absolutely loved it. I liked it so much more than teaching cell and molecular biology. And then I was married at the time, and I followed my husband. I was a trailing spouse and went to the University of California, San Francisco, where I taught nutrition to medical students for 8 years. And when I got fired from that, I went to public health school and got a master's in public health nutrition. And I worked for the government in Washington for 2 years as the editor of what was called the Surgeon General's Report on Nutrition and Health, a great big book reviewing the science of nutrition and health. I went from being a fired lecturer at the University of California, San Francisco, to a full professor at NYU with tenure in 2 years.
Wow.
Not bad. Thank you. Thank you. I consider that the greatest achievement of my career, and to this day, I don't know how it happened, but I did describe what happened in the memoir. Yeah. But I mean, it was just such a stroke of luck. And I've been at NYU ever since. I retired in 2017. This is what retirement looks like. I have 2 books coming out this year, one in June and one in November. And that sounds more impressive than it is because the June book is a piece of the November book that's been published separately. And the new book is What to Eat Now, which is a new edition of a book I wrote 20 years ago. And it's basically what I think about food and nutrition issues using supermarkets as an organizing device. I go around the supermarket section by section and talk about every issue I can think of that gets raised by the products in that supermarket. And the most complicated part by far was the fish counter. Fish are really complicated. And there are 5 chapters on fish, and they took the 5 fish chapters and put them in a separate book called a little teeny book called The Fish Counter, which is part of a series of books on oceans, streams, and rivers that they're publishing. That one's coming out first. And for 2026, I'm doing the most fun project ever, which is a book with a colleague on the history of food and nutrition policy and marketing, food marketing in the United States, using cereal boxes as illustrations. Wow. I've collected cereal boxes for years. I wanted something to do with them. I found something to do with them. It's going to be really fun.
How have you seen nutrition education evolve Have you seen a higher amount of interest? Are there more students really going after it?
When I started out in nutrition, I really, really, really cared about nutrients. I loved every single one of them. I thought they were wonderful. I taught what they did. I taught what their structures were. I taught what foods they came from. And eventually I figured out that people don't eat nutrients, they eat food. And that looking at one nutrient at a time doesn't make any sense at all. And then I thought, looking at one food at a time doesn't make any sense at all. You really have to, people don't eat foods, they eat diets. Diets are very complicated. I moved on to food systems, which, sort of the starting narrow and expanding. You're part of the food system. Yeah. You're dealing with the waste, and that's really important. Whenever RFK Jr. says, we don't need vaccines for measles, what we need is for everybody to have vitamin A, C, and E and a healthy immune system, there's a grain of truth there. But I just cringe. Because really, for measles, vaccinations would work a lot better. Yeah. And the idea that we have measles back is just...
It's crazy.
Is really crazy.
It's really crazy. And we're... Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, at the time that I taught nutrition for the first time in 1975, everybody said, oh, there's so much interest in nutrition. Everybody's interested in it. Everybody's still interested in it. Everybody eats.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why it's fun.
Yeah.
Everybody can relate to it. And it relates to every single issue I can think of that's important in society.
Do you think if there's any ways that we could actually effectively regulate the marketing of unhealthy foods? Do you think there's...
If we had a government. If I were the government, of course there's a way to do it. Of course. First of all, you regulate portion size. You regulate marketing. You tell them that they can't mark junk foods, and you can't market junk foods to children. You get them out of schools. You keep food companies out of public policy. You don't let them anywhere near where public policy is being done. You stop the lobbying. You stop the campaign contributions. You make all of that totally transparent. There are tons of things you could do. Well, the problem with advocacy is you don't get paid for it. Lobbyists get paid for it. They get paid a lot. And their total job is to try to convince members of Congress not to do anything bad to the company. They're really good at what they do.
My background is as a cook. I only ever been a cook. And, using excess food and family meal and everything that you can do has always been a part of my training. And it was very shocking to me when I started Rethink that the idea of using excess food was very foreign to people, to use the surplus food to make great food for people. But what did you mean by that? Like, what was it like before people weren't thinking about using the excess and sustainable product?
Well, this is really on my mind because do you all know who Joan Gossell unfortunately was? She was a professor at the Teachers College at Columbia. She was one of the first people back in the 1970s and 80s to start talking about what I call food systems, everything that happens to a food from the time it's produced until the time it's consumed and wasted. And she caught on to that long before. She was writing papers about dietary guidelines and sustainability in the early 1980s. I mean, really way, way back, and arguing that you could not understand why people ate the way they did unless you understood how food was produced and what the whole food production system is like. The easiest way to explain what the food system looks like is there's a graph that the Department of Agriculture puts out that shows what happens to all of the corn that's produced in the United States. 45% of it goes to feed animals. Another 45% goes to make ethanol fuel for automobiles, leaving roughly 10%, it's actually less than 10%, for all of the uses that corn has, which goes way beyond corn on the cob, and it's things like cornstarch and ingredients that are used in industrial production of other things. Practically none of the corn that's produced in the United States is food for people. That's our food system. There's something wrong with that. There's something really wrong with that. And she caught on to that really early on.
How do you define food justice, and what do you think we can do at Rethink here to help achieve it?
I actually don't ever use the term because when I do, it's off-putting to a lot of people. You know, it's like capitalism. When I would say 10 years ago, 5 years ago, if I used the word capitalism in a lecture, you could just see everybody tightening up and getting very tense and very uncomfortable. And so I stopped using the word. And now I find that when I start talking about how the food system works and what's going on and why food corporations behave the way they do, somebody from the audience will say, aren't you talking about capitalism? You know, so I don't have to do it because somebody else does. So I don't talk about food justice for the same reason. It's one of those woke terms. It's on the list. And if you haven't seen the list, you should, on Friday this week, I'm posting the list of terms that if somebody who's writing a federal grant or writing a federal paper uses, they can't do it. They won't get their grant and they can't put their name on the paper. And that list of words absolutely has justice on it. But it also includes things like community and women.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. To me, it means that everybody has access to healthy, affordable, accessible, and delicious diet.
And one that they recognize and understand. We're huge fans on
Sure.
making sure that...
You know, culturally appropriate. This is a commercial. My blog is foodpolitics.com, and my post tomorrow will be the list.
After all of this and everything what's going on, and I've been talking to a lot of like community leaders and nonprofit leaders about this, like what does give you hope for the future of food?
You. Look who's here. Look at what you're working on. That does it for me. I mean, I've been lucky enough to teach students and to be dealing with students at NYU in food studies in particular. And food studies students come to NYU wanting to change the world through food. How could you not be hopeful?
Any advice for people that are really early in their career and they want to get out there and they're walking into this climate? Like, what would you...
Do what you can. Do the best you can. I mean, beyond that, there's not much you can do. I mean, it's very, very difficult. So in the meantime, you do what you can do. You do what feels good, what feels valuable. You look for things that feel valuable to you and do them. And you do it on a local level. You know, I mean, it's really, you can make such a big difference on the local level to people who are in need and people who need help and people, you know, who are worth helping in some way. And, you know, I tell people start in schools. Schools really matter. What goes on in schools matters a lot. Run for, if you're ambitious, run for local office. You want power, run for local office and use that office to try to get good stuff done. Join organizations that are working on these things, because the more people who are involved in, you know, in these kinds of activities, the better chance you have of getting them done. You keep doing what you think is the right thing and try to get as many people to help you with it as you can. And if you want to know how to do basic community organizing, there's a really great book. And it's called Organizing for Social Change. It's a paper-bound book. It comes out of something called the Midwest Academy. It's fabulous.
You've been like really kind of flirting with the idea of like, how can we run direct to consumer? Because, you know, when you leverage excess food, you know, the main reason we use excess food is because it's free, you know, keeps the cost down on the cost per unit and helps us feed more people and effectively lower the...
And it's a very good thing to do. It stops waste, you know, and uses up waste.
Yeah.
No, otherwise it's pet food.
Yeah. I mean, you know...
Which is another useful thing to be done.
You know, you think about like smoked salmon, that's a preservative. Ratatouille is a preservative. You know, people made ratatouille as a preservative. Like these things that we've learned to cook as cooks has been mainly around how do you extend shelf life. Back to your model about how do you actually like build the scale and have a successful business model. Like, have you seen any like good examples of ways that people are getting good access to healthy, nutritious food here, LA, anywhere, Europe?
Small,
Yeah.
small scale. Kaiser Permanente on the West Coast is a huge health maintenance organization that's been around for a long time, and it's not for profit. That doesn't mean it doesn't want to make money, but it's a non-for-profit organization, so it can afford to do things that NYU Langone can't afford to do, or thinks it can't afford to do. And they're really, really interested in preventive health care, because the way they explained it to me once was 10% of our patient population, which is enormous, millions and millions and millions of people, 10% of our patient population uses up 90% of our healthcare costs. If we could reduce that 10% by 1%, we would have enough money to build more hospitals, pay the doctors better. And so that's what they were interested in, is what can we do to make our patient population healthier? Well, for one thing, they do a lot of preventive health care. It doesn't cost them as much money.
Yeah.
Everybody should be doing that, right?
Yeah.
And so they have community gardens.
Right.
At Kaiser Permanente, almost every hospital has a garden. They're doing all kinds of things around food to try to make their patient popular. They have a lot of poor patients who somehow have gotten into it through whether work or you have to have an institution that supports you for getting into it.
We really are always curious about this, but like, what is some really good advice you've received that's kind of shaped your career, or the best advice that you've ever gotten?
Just to keep doing what you're doing. Persist. I tell the story in the memoir about when I was being fired at UCSF, which was a very, very traumatic experience, I have to say. I got very good advice about going to public health school and persisting and hanging in there. And I think the hanging in there is really critical, that when things are not going well, you have to put more time in, not less. You have to work harder. I never had what people call mentors now. I didn't even know the word until, but it would have been nice to have had somebody to advise me earlier, I think.
Yeah.
Would I have taken it? That's another matter. That's another matter.
Now we're going to move to some staff questions.
Key question that I've been grappling with a lot is, how do you both do the incredible and important work that happens in an academic environment around studying food politic and coming to terms with literature in that space without disconnecting from the reality on the ground and what communities need in food justices?
I read a lot. And by this time, because I've been writing this blog for so long, people send me things. And I read what they send me. And so I get a sense, without actually having to go out and interview people on the streets, although I do a fair amount of that too. I'm very interested in the new GLP-1 drugs. And anybody who tells me that they're taking it, they get interviewed. But mostly I read a lot. I read an extraordinary amount. I've never stopped doing that. I subscribe to about 20 food newsletters that come in every day. And by this time I can go through them very, very quickly, pull out what I think I need, ignore the rest of it. And I read really broadly. I read newspapers, I read magazines, I read Twitter, I read or whatever it is. I read a lot of emailed things come in. Sometimes I get so much that I cry, but that doesn't happen. Usually I can handle it. But yesterday, for example, I was asked to give a lecture on what is going on in Washington in food. And I got sent by I was making slides up until the minute I went to give that class because the stuff was just pouring in.
So how do you think that like food policy can like bridge the gap between kind of like what Patrice was asking about how it's interacting on the ground? How do you think food policy specifically can overcome that?
Well, the best way to see that in action is in schools. So there's a policy for what gets served in a school meal, right? That's the policy. I have been to lots and lots and lots of schools, and let me tell you, they're totally different from one another. They're completely different. There are two issues involved in school food: making the food taste edible and getting the kids to eat it. And let me tell you, these are two completely different skills. And I have been in schools and seen every possible combination. It depends completely on who is in the school, whether they know the names of the kids, and whether they care even this much whether the kids eat the food or not. Policy gives schools permission to make healthy, delicious food if there's somebody there who wants to do that. If there isn't, it doesn't do any good at all. So that's the answer. I'm going to confess thinking that taking sodas out of SNAP is not a bad idea. People can buy sodas with their own money. If that discourages them from buying sodas, that's a good thing. And can we also put some restrictions on what the soda industry is doing to market sodas to SNAP recipients? Could we do that? Could we deal with retailers and how they deal with SNAP recipients? I think we could.
Because I was actually curious with your research and grocery stores, I've heard rumors that there's intentional placement in a lot of products. So
that's not a rumor.
Discerning the truths between what they're being offered, I think, would that be helpful in home ec based off of?
Of course it would if home ec existed, which it doesn't.
Yeah.
Which it doesn't.
Take that back, feels ideal.
Yeah, but to talk about, not only is the placement of products in supermarkets intentional, companies pay the supermarkets to put their products where they can be seen. That's how supermarkets stay afloat, through what they're called slotting fees. And yeah, you could teach kids. I think Alice Waters has this edible schoolyard project where she's trying to put gardens in schools. Everybody thought she was absolutely a nutcase. It makes a huge difference. I visited schools with these programs, and the kids eat salads. Wow. They really do. And they, not everybody, but most of them do. It's so basic. Every school should.
Oh my God. What is your take on that tension of the necessity of wanting us to have equitable access to healthy food, but also the resources that schools just don't have, people are looking at underserved communities?
The food part of schools is the only part of schools that's expected to be self-funding.
Yeah.
Nothing else in a school is supposed to raise its own money and cover its own costs except for the food. And the government amount of money that the government gives to schools is not enough to do it decently, and particularly in expensive cities. It's really, really tough. So when the schools say, we wish we could do this and we wish we could afford it, and they can't, I'm very sympathetic. I had a friend who wrote a book about how to game the Department of Agriculture system so that if you do your own cooking and you use Department of Agriculture commodities instead of the pre-cooked commodities, you can save huge amounts of money. And she would go into a school and say, I can save you $100,000 a year if you do your own cooking. But not all schools have kitchens. So that's also a problem. But there are ways of doing it if you've got staff in the schools who want to do it. And I've been in schools like that, in some of the poorest areas in Brooklyn, for example. I went to a school in Bushwick that, oh my goodness, that was, really, really, the food was fabulous, and the kids were eating it, and the staff knew the names of all the kids. And I said to the school food service director, how did this happen? And she said, have you met the principal? I had not. I then met the principal, and then I understood how it happened. You mean, what do I want to know?
What do you want to know?
What do I want to know? I want to know things all the time. I mean, I'm deluged with information.
Yeah.
Just absolutely deluged. By this time, I've been teaching nutrition since 1975. That's 50 years, right? Yeah. So I have 50 years. I mean, I may be losing it, but I've got 50 years of accumulated information. I've got a structure because I've taught it. And when you teach, you have to develop a structure. So I have a structural way of thinking about nutrition, and all these new things get plugged into that structure. I don't have to start by developing the structure, which did not come easily. It did not come easily. It took me years to get the structure in place where I could learn things quickly and not have to spend a lot of time in the library. And remember, I was doing all this when there were paper books and libraries and the internet didn't exist. So it was much slower. Now it's a piece of cake. You know, I mean, the internet makes learning things about this so much easier. All you have to do is have enough of the structure to be able to distinguish between information and misinformation. I'm pretty good at it, although sometimes I get caught. But you get better at it. The more you read and the deeper you read. And I don't in any way want you to think that it came quickly or easily. It was a big, big research project that went on for years. I mean, part of it was when I went to the University of California, San Francisco, and was teaching medical students, I was scared that they knew more than I did. So I mean, it's one thing to keep ahead of a freshman, but to keep ahead of a medical student made me very nervous. And also, they were being taught things that I didn't know. So I worked really hard for a lot of years. But by this time, it's a piece of cake. You know, it really is.
Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.